From Toronto, Canada, The Conspiracy Show with Richard Serra.
Thanks for inviting me into your home, long-haul truck, RV, camper, taxi, your parents' well-appointed rec room, your loft, that greasy spoon just off the interstate, and your cabin in the woods. Rosemary Ellen Guilley is standing by. She's got a brand new book called Haunted Hills and Hollows, What's Lurking in Greene County, Pennsylvania. Rosemary Ellen Guilley, welcome back to The Conspiracy Show. How are you?
Hi. Well, busy as ever, Richard, and even though I'm thrilled to be sharing my birthday today with the Conspiracy Show folks, it's never a dull day in my life. I'm constantly working, and as you can imagine, I have all kinds of projects in the pipeline.
Well, first of all, happy birthday, a very happy birthday. I hope you had a good one.
It was a wonderful day, and yes, I actually did relax a little bit.
Good for you. Good for you. So what is the genesis of Haunted Hills and Hollows? How did this come about? I mean, you're hyper-focusing on Greene County, Pennsylvania. There's enough going on in this one county to fill an entire volume. That's remarkable.
There really is, and the book was the result of years of investigations. And even though it's a small geographic area, it really is a bellwether for weird phenomena that goes on everywhere. It's just very concentrated in this part of Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is a very active state. It's one of the top 10 in Bigfoot sightings and encounters. It has a lot of UFO activity, a lot of hauntings. It's got a lot of abandoned mines that contribute to hauntings. And Greene County is no exception. Well, this all started for me in 2010, and my co-author, Kevin Paul, who is a lifelong resident of Greene County, heard me on the radio. And he sent me an email, and he said, hey, you ought to come down here. We got a lot of stuff going on. Well, I get emails like that all the time from all over. And, of course, I can't simply go everywhere. And, sometimes places might have a little bit, but that would be it. But there was something about his email that just resonated with me, and I thought, I've got to check this out. So I arranged to go to Pennsylvania. I was living in Connecticut at the time, still am, and I did some investigations with Kevin and some research, and I was just blown away by the territory, the terrain, the history, the activity. Nothing had ever been written about it before. And Kevin, being a lifelong resident, he knows where all the bodies are buried, literally and figuratively. And so we started this research project. And the result is a book that has become a bestseller, which is very unusual for a regional book. It's a good read. The stories are creepy. And we hit bestseller in 3 categories on Amazon and in Kindle. It's been a real rip-roaring ride, and I'm really pleased because I think the stories are just fascinating.
Well, just listen to the chapter titles. I mean, how could you resist? The Lobster Alien and Other Strange Beings, Massacres, Blood-Soaked Ground, Mounds and Disturbed Burials, Strange Activity Near Lapping Farm, Black Blobs and Mole Things, Freaky Franklin Township, The Ghost of Frank Bryan, Mystery People and Black-Eyed People, Crazy Hauntings, Weird Warrior Trail. Is there one a township in particular within Greene County that has more of its share of paranormal goings on, or is it distributed evenly throughout the county?
I would say it's distributed pretty evenly. It's just that we hear more about things in the more populated areas like Franklin County and, of course, Waynesburg, which is the county seat. There's a lot in Greene County, and it butts up against West Virginia, and so that's where the hills and hollows come in. There are a lot of very remote areas. They're sparsely populated. People have lived there for generations and have experienced things that, over the passage of time, with some of them it becomes almost accepted, a part of the backdrop of life. Oh yeah, we get UFO activity all the time, that sort of thing. Or every now and then we see certain cryptids. And so a lot of it was going around to some of these more remote areas and digging out the stories. And we interviewed a lot of people. We did original field work. Kevin did an amazing amount of historical research, because that figures into it too. The energy of the land, I think, is a lot of what drives the hauntings in this part of Pennsylvania. You have abandoned mine tunnels, active mine tunnels. Fracking has been going on, oil and gas drilling, things that disturb what is underneath the earth, which is the domain of the spirit world. And you've got this history, this very bloody history of colonial and Indian clashes and massacres, houses being built on top of old Indian mounds and cemeteries, and nobody knows it until they excavate and things start to happen. And these things happen elsewhere too, but it struck me that Greene County was really a crucible for a lot of these things, and that's why we call it the most haunted county in America.
Oh, wow. You must have been like a kid in the candy store.
I'll tell you, we were, and our research lasted years. You know, when I started investigating with Kevin, I wasn't necessarily thinking of a book. I just wanted to get the lay of the landscape and maybe do some interesting cases and collect some stories. And the deeper that we went, the more it became apparent to me that there was incredible material for a book. And as I emphasized, no one had ever written about it before. And I think that's one of the reasons for the book's tremendous success as well, is that it's fresh paranormal territory. And due to the overheated aspect of the paranormal field for so many years, there isn't a whole lot of fresh territory ground to overturn. And so this represents something brand new with new cases, new stories, and yet the kinds of things we describe could go on anywhere.
All right, well, let's kick it off with this lobster alien tale. How did that story come to you?
Well, that's my favorite story, and that's why we opened the book with it. Attempted abduction by a lobster thing. And ultimately, we don't know whether it was an alien per se, like an ET or some sort of cryptid. But Kevin had known the woman who was involved, Sherry, which is a pseudonym. A lot of people asked us for pseudonyms because they've lived in the area so long and they know everybody. Although their stories are fairly well known. She had lived in one of these remote hollow areas or hollers with her family, which had been there for generations. And the area is very haunted, has a lot of activity. She had apparitions that came into her bedroom, shadow people. There was a lot of UFO activity overhead, which would shine lights down on the house. Her parents were really kind of blasé about it. And when she was growing up, she would comment on something that showed up in her bedroom, and her mom would say, "Oh, that's just the aliens looking in on you," or if it seemed to be human, like, "Oh, that's just Grandma wanting to check up on you." And so it got passed off in that way. There were a lot of shadow figures in the roads at night, and she was often afraid to go from the house to the barn at night because of these shadow figures. There also was an interesting area behind the house. It was a hill that she would like to walk on, sometimes with her dog, and it seemed to have a force field, that there was an area that she felt that she was passing through some sort of like a barrier. And we were wondering if there might be some kind of electromagnetic anomaly or something that creating a literal portal, because if she went through this barrier on the hill, she experienced missing time. And whether or not she was ever abducted during that missing time, we don't know, because she never had any conscious recollection and she did not want to do regression. But the seminal event that we're talking about tonight, the lobster thing, occurred when she was a teenager. And she had a bedroom on the second story of her house. She went to bed one night and woke up in the middle of the night, as these experiences always happen. And her window has transformed itself. It doesn't have any glass in it. It's got a brilliant light in it that seems to be glowing. And in this window area is what looks like a giant lobster, which she gauged to be about 7 or 8 feet tall, and it had enormous claws. And as she looked at it, it reached in the window and grabbed her by an arm and dragged her off the bed and pulled her toward the window as though it wanted to abduct her.
Oh, my goodness.
Have you ever heard of such a thing? We have greys and reptilians and, other kinds of aliens coming to abduct people, but lobster things?
No, I mean, not since those really cheesy science fiction movies involving, large creatures on the island of Japan in the 1960s.
Well, exactly. And in fact, many of these stories fall into the, oh my gosh, you can't make this stuff up category. The witnesses are all very credible, many of them known by my co-author for a long period of time, and he can vouch for them. So we didn't feel that anybody was pulling our leg. But she struggles against this thing mightily, and it drops her and retreats out the window, and she passes out. Well, she wakes up the next morning, and she's curled up on the floor, and the arm where this creature had grabbed her is sore and black and blue with bruises. She was so upset because she was willing to pass it off as some weird nightmare, but she couldn't explain how she landed on the floor, and the bruises that were on her arm where this thing had grabbed her. She was so upset by it that she did not tell her parents for a very, very long time because she thought nobody's going to believe me. It's one thing to have.
Rosemary, I got to jump in here. We'll take a quick time out and come back. Rosemary Ellen Guilley, Haunted Hills and Hollows. What lurks in Greene County, Pennsylvania? Right here on The Conspiracy Show. Don't go away.
When in doubt, blame the government. You're listening to The Conspiracy Show with Richard Serrett.
We are back with Rosemary Ellen Guilley, paranormal investigator, joins us once a month here on The Conspiracy Show. Her latest, a bestseller. This thing is going nuts at Amazon. Haunted Hills and Hollows, What Lurks in Greene County, Pennsylvania. This is about 8 years in the making, a lot of field research, and just jam-packed. Not only is the book jam-packed, but Greene County, apparently, is just jam-packed with paranormal occurrences. And Rosemary has labeled it the most haunted county in America. So back to this lobster alien story that grabbed this woman, this kind of a botched alien abduction, perhaps. How does this end?
Well, it never came back. And so she doesn't, we're left to speculate. And she didn't know either why it never came back. Did she put up too much of a struggle? Perhaps it went on to something that was easier pickings, perhaps. A lot of these experiences are one-offs, and we don't know why they happen or why they don't happen again. But this lobster thing was part of I would say a zoo of unusual entities that we encountered in our investigations, like the mole things.
Yes.
Another weird entity that, and this both of us do believe was tied to the disturbance of Native American artifacts. And a man who was remodeling a house found under his porch what appeared to be an artifact, a Native American mortar and pestle. And he took it out from that spot and brought it into the house. After he did that, he started being visited first by black blobs, just black pillars and blobby things that would come into the house and follow him around and show up wherever he was. And it was quite unnerving. And those eventually gave way to a shape-shifting phenomenon where the thing would start out as a black blob and then shape-shift into what he could only describe as a mole thing. It resembled a mole, and it had enormous clawed feet. So, again, nighttime attacks, this thing scuttling along the wall, and then pouncing upon him in bed and start ripping at him like it was trying to claw a hole in his body.
Oh, my Lord.
This happened when he was sleeping on his stomach, and it happened when he was sleeping on his back. These were terrifying attacks. And then other members of his family started seeing this blob thing, too. And he finally put two and two together that none of this happened. And I think a lot of residents are used to kind of weird things happening in their homes there. There's a lot of haunted places. But none of this happened until he had found the mortar and pestle and disturbed it. So he took it and, with a prayer, put it back where he had found it in the dirt underneath his house. It had a raised porch, and the activity stopped. So was this black blob some kind of spirit guardian of old artifacts? Was this sitting on mound territory? And one of the things that we have to realize here is that in this part of Pennsylvania, and it extends into West Virginia and Ohio as well, the ancient mound builders were all over the place. And so there are many Native American burial sites that were never marked, of course, mounds that got abandoned and covered over, and then the settlers come in and build on top of them. And so a lot of these things aren't even found until construction goes on. Well, then you have the question of, do we stop construction, do we excavate these relics, or do we just keep on going? And many people have felt that, just keep on going. It's only a few bits of pottery and bones and whatnot, no problem. But then they build their house on top of this, and then wonder why their house is haunted.
Right. And so let's talk about the Native Americans that lived in the area. Now, is this considered part of the Ohio Valley?
Well, I guess the greater Ohio Valley. The big river that runs through part of Greene County is the Monongahela. And it comes down, the Monongahela runs past Pittsburgh as well. But this part of the country has a long and rich haunted history. Ohio has a tremendous amount of activities. I mentioned Greene County butts up against part of West Virginia, which has similar kinds of activity. And it also, county-wise, borders Fayette County, Pennsylvania, which is probably the most active county in Pennsylvania for Bigfoot and cryptid sightings. So there's a lot of weird energy in this part. It's the very southwest corner of Pennsylvania. A lot of weird energy that has remained undisturbed, a lot of it undisturbed until recent times. And Greene County and Waynesburg used to be really sleepy. Waynesburg was a sleepy little town. It's still little. But the oil and gas drilling started to heat up within the past decade. They started fracking, taking the gas out of the shale, and that brought kind of a boom economy to the area. So it's grown considerably. But once you get outside of it's hard to even call it an urban environment. It's more like a small town environment. You're really out in the sticks in some very remote places. And yet these parts are being disturbed, too, by people who want to live further out, so they find a remote area and build something on it. We had one of the chapters in the book concerned a farm investigation that we did. That was one of the first cases that Kevin brought me in on.
Is this Lapping, the Lapping farm?
No, this is at the end of the book. It's a chapter called Angry Spirits of the Land. And it was an old abandoned piece of farm that sat on top of abandoned mine tunnels that was purchased by a commercial interest for some experimental farming. And there was an old farmhouse built in the 1800s that had been abandoned, didn't have any indoor plumbing. A man was hired to manage the property, and he would use the abandoned farmhouse as his headquarters, but it wasn't livable, so, he lived in another town. And when the activity started up on the farm, it seemed to rile something up. There was something that lived on the land that got very angry at the presence of human beings and machinery and stuff going on. And it started reacting against anybody who spent any amount of time there or worked there. I did investigate that on and off over a period of several years. We had sightings of what we called an imp cat. We called it an imp cat because it had kind of a demonic look to it. It would peek in the windows. There were apparitions of human beings that walked around the property. There were shape-shifted apparitions that looked part human, part something else. Kevin actually, or excuse me, not Kevin, but the fellow who managed the place actually captured a photograph of something looking out of one of the windows, and we have it in the book, that looks half human with a cat head.
Oh, my God. Rosemary, I got to tell you, Greene County is starting to make Skinwalker's Ranch look like a big snore.
Well, it could certainly give Skinwalker Ranch a run for its money. It's a much bigger territory, of course, than the ranch, but the variety of activity. We had shadow people on that piece of property. We had phantom animals that defied explanation. We just called them the little gray scurrying things because they seemed to be amalgams of different kinds of animals. But there was this resident spirit of the land that communicated to us through the ghost box and also in a seance we had that it was ancient. It had been there long before people. This was its territory. It didn't like people on its territory. Everybody should leave, and if people did not leave, it was going to make everybody miserable until people did get out. And it took several years, but eventually human activity was driven off the property because the farm could not be commercially viable. Something was always going wrong. And the property sits abandoned today, so the entity of the land won the battle.
Do you suspect the jinn?
It's certainly a possibility, and I did entertain that idea because the jinn are ancient, and they also like territory, and it certainly would fit their behavior pattern to start acting out against humans that they considered squatters on their property. You have to think of it as like, well, how would you feel if squatters came and set up in your house or your second cabin or whatever, and just decided to live there and do whatever they wanted? Well, these energetic things happen as well, and there are plenty of examples of this all over the place. Paranormal investigators have gone into so many places where there seems to be a resident force that is not real friendly to people. So this is something, interestingly, that Plato said we needed to take into account. Plato said there are places on the earth where people are not meant to be for whatever reason. The gods live there, spirits live there. We have to be respectful of those abodes. We have the attitude today that if we want to live somewhere, we just go in and bulldoze down the trees, cut the brush, put up our house, and if there's something invisible there that doesn't like it, well, that's too bad.
Haunted Hills and Hollows. What lurks in Greene County, Pennsylvania? Well, a whole lot, apparently. Rosemary Ellen Guilley is with us. VisionaryLiving.com, the website. It almost makes you... all of these disturbing entities makes you sort of pine for just a good old run-of-the-mill Sasquatch. But there are plenty of those in Greene County. In fact, the Lobster girl, what was her name, her pseudonym again? Sherry? Was it Sherry that had the encounter with the lobster?
Yes.
She also had encounters with Bigfoot, did she not?
She did, yes. And they would howl at night. It's not uncommon in these remote parts of the county to hear what people feel is Bigfoot howling at night. And in fact, another name for Sasquatch in that area, they're literally called the Night Howlers.
Ooh, I like that name, the Night Howlers. That'd be a name. That'd be a great Seattle band, I think, the Night Howlers. And how prevalent are Sasquatch in Greene County? I mean, does everybody, not everybody, but do loads and loads of people have Sasquatch stories, did you find?
Well, when I researched the reported records, Greene County is not one of the most active. It butts up against the most active county in Pennsylvania, but the number of reported cases to organizations that collect that information is lower than other counties in the state. I think it's just a matter of reportage, because when you get out in the field and you start talking to people about their experiences, you might contact someone because they've had a certain kind of sighting, and then if you ask them, have you had any other encounters or activity, then they'll volunteer things like unusual cryptids or Sasquatch. So I think that there's probably plenty of activity. It just has been underreported. Now, the Bigfoot researchers in Pennsylvania that I know and have had discussions with have said the same thing. I just published a book this spring called Chasing the Elusive Pennsylvania Bigfoot by a very well-known Pennsylvania ufologist and Bigfoot researcher, Paul G. Johnson. And when he started his research 20 years ago, there wasn't very much documented in certain counties, but he and others made a concerted effort to seek out reports, advertise for reports, and follow up on things that they heard about through the media or secondhand, and compiled quite a database of activity. So I think it's just a matter of ferreting it out.
All right, we'll take a time out. Maybe the fact is there's just simply not room enough for Bigfoot in Greene County. There's too many other things, lobsters and moles and black blobs and so many other crazy things going on. We'll come back. Let's talk about the ghost of Frank Bryan on the other side. Rosemary Ellen Guilley here on The Conspiracy Show. Stay with us.
The truth is not out there. It's right here. The Conspiracy Show with Richard Syrett.
Haunted hills and hollows. What is lurking in Greene County, Pennsylvania? Rosemary Ellen Guilley's latest. And so much going on in this rural county in southwestern Pennsylvania, butts up against West Virginia. Who was Frank Bryan?
Well, the ghost of Frank Bryan started out as a joke, and we included this story because it's one of Kevin's personal stories. He's had a lot of haunting experiences, and it's an example of how you shouldn't take things lightly. You shouldn't take paranormal things lightly. And it concerns a dairy that Frank Bryan owned. It was called Bryan's Dairy in Waynesburg. It was hugely popular. Delivered very good products. The kids always liked to go there for milkshakes and ice cream. And Kevin, when he was in school, so it would have been high school for him, two of his friends, which we call Tom and Jerry in the book, again pseudonyms, they worked at the store, and they would close up at night. Well, one of them was kind of skittish about the paranormal, and so they decided to play a joke on the boy who was kind of afraid by telling him that the storeroom was haunted, and then send him into the storeroom by himself at night. It would kind of freak him out. And after they had joked around with him for a while, they confessed to playing a joke on him, and real phenomena happened. At the very moment that they were laughing hysterically over their joke on this poor guy, containers of ice cream and paper cups and supplies literally flew off the shelf behind the counter. It was as though an invisible hand had just gone down the counter and swiped everything off with a great force. And they weren't near the shelf. Nobody had touched it. There was no way to account for that. But it was like, well, you think nothing is here? Well, you better think again. And after that, Kevin said he took the paranormal very seriously.
And did that particular poltergeist activity continue?
Well, I believe it did, although the two boys who worked there laid low about it for a long time because both of them were spooked. And the dairy is long since closed. It doesn't exist anymore. But and I'm not sure what replaced it there, what business is there now. But it wouldn't surprise me if that spot had some kind of activity in the place.
Well, despite the fact that the whole county seems to be a hot spot, there's one hot spot of hot spots, apparently, called Rice's Landing. Tell me about it. What's going on there?
Rice's Landing is indeed a spooky place, and Kevin and I went a number of times to Rice's Landing. One of the things that there are two stories that draw paranormal people to the area, and one is an old legend called Stovepipe. And the legend goes, there are variations of it, but the legend goes that there was a miner who was at odds with, it was a union, non-union sort of confrontation. And he liked to wear a stovepipe hat. And the road that goes down Rice's Landing to the Monongahela River is very steep and windy. And one night he was going down this at a very brisk pace in his with his horse and carriage and had an accident and fell off and was decapitated by the carriage. And so the legend is that his ghost walks around looking for his head. And if you go there at night, especially around midnight, and you go to one of the bends in this road and call out, "Stovepipe, stovepipe, stovepipe," 3 times, his ghost supposedly will appear. But like an urban legend, it's like, well, you don't want to call him in because maybe he'll take your head, if he can't find his.
Oh, I love this one. This is wonderful.
The other story really is a sad tragedy, and it was the murder of a little grade school girl. This goes back several decades, and there are a lot of homes in the area around Rice's Landing. There's a big park in the middle of it. There's a riverfront area where, when the paddle wheel boats were in vogue, there was a lot of port activity. But in 1973, this murder took place. Her name was Deborah, and she was 8 years old. She got off the bus to walk to her home, which was very normal at the time. And in fact, her 2 brothers were out about in the area, and so were neighbors, and she was seen walking home, but she never made it home. And her body was discovered several days later in buried in a shallow kind of grave underneath some forest debris.
Let me just jump in, Rosemary. We'll pick up on this story on the other side. Rosemary Ellen Guilley, Haunted Hills and Hollows, What's Lurking in Greene County, Pennsylvania. Back with more of The Conspiracy Show right after this.
Keeping an eye on the New World Order. This is The Conspiracy Show with Richard Syrett.
We are back with Rosemary Ellen Guilley, Haunted Hills and Hollows, What's Lurking in Greene County, Pennsylvania. It's a bestseller, folks. Is it available at visionaryliving.com as well?
Yes, it is. Visionary Living, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, all the usual places.
Are you doing autographed copies?
Yes, in fact. And we can hardly keep them in stock.
Terrific. All right. So before the break, we were talking about this tragic story in an area of Greene County called Rice's Landing. This involved the murder of a young 8-year-old girl coming home from school. She didn't make it home. They found her body in a shallow grave in the forest. So if you wanted to pick up this tragic story from there, Rosemary.
It really is tragic. She had been raped and strangled with a piece of twine.
Oh,
and
dear.
40 years later, this murder has never been solved. What a heartbreak for the family. And so many people feel that the area where her body was found is haunted, and people will sometimes see apparitions of a little girl, or they feel an incredible heavy sadness in the area, but no solution to the murder.
Oh, dear. Of all the places that you visited, because, I mean, this was, boots on the ground kind of research. You did some investigating in the field. What was the scariest place for you?
The scariest place would have to be that farm, the experimental farm where the entity wanted everybody to leave. I did quite a few overnight investigations there, and they were scary, what manifested. We had manifestations of very threatening shadow figures, humanoid forms that look like men wearing coats and hats. There was an enormous black blob that would be seen outside. The farm was located in some hilly territory, and it would come out of the woods and move along in the hills and play hide and seek in the trees. It could actually hide itself behind a very skinny tree trunk. Sometimes we saw balls of light floating over the property in different colors. They would bob over the ground and then just drop into the ground and completely disappear. There were swirling tornadoes of what appeared to be heavy black, like black ink tornadoes that would manifest in the second floor of the house. Since no one was there at night, unless we were investigating, the place was always locked up. And it was not unusual for Jack, the man who managed the place, to come in the morning and find that the windows were open. They had been locked, but the windows were open, and there were mysterious muddy footprints on the windowsills that looked creature-like. The front door might be open. Couldn't explain any of that. One of the experimental things that they were doing was raising chickens, and the chickens would be found mysteriously dead, not like a predator would get into the coop and, kind of tear them up. And this happened even on investigation night, where in the morning we would find dead chickens, and there hadn't even been a ruckus in the chicken coop.
Oh, my gosh.
Like if a fox or something got in. And the odd thing about that is that the chickens would be laid out neatly in a row, which is something a predator doesn't do.
Were their necks broken?
And they would just be dead.
Mm.
It was very strange. People who came and worked on the place had mysterious cuts and rashes that developed on their skin. Machinery broke down all the time. We got as I mentioned, we got threatening messages over the ghost box and via the seance. Many things were tried to get rid of it. We tried doing a Native American tobacco ceremony. We tried exorcisms of various kinds. Nothing would dislodge this entity. And when the farm commercially couldn't make a go of it, it was just abandoned. People wouldn't stay very long who came to work there. They would have some sort of freaked out experience. There was one example that we relate in the book. A young college volunteer, a lot of students volunteered for the farm, and he was very devout. He brought his Bible every day to read at lunchtime, which is, perfectly natural to, read the book of your choice. Well, he was alone one day in the farmhouse downstairs having his lunch, reading the Bible, and he hears walking upstairs. So he thinks that Jack is in the house, and he didn't know it. Presently, Jack comes in from the outside, and this totally freaked this young man out. He said, well, if we're the only two here on the property and you just came in, who's upstairs? Jack said, son, there's some things I got to tell you about this place. Mm-hmm. And he never came back. People wanted to bring guns on the property as if guns would help against something invisible.
Right. Well, when you're witnessing this, when it's happening to you, are you more excited because, this is your profession, this is what you do, and you're actually getting to experience it, not just read about it, but it's happening? Or are you more frightened? Does the excitement override the fear? Tell me about that.
I'm usually excited because I want to document things. I want to see what kind of evidence I can capture. I want a personal experience that I'm able to relate. So I'm usually very excited. But there are times when things get very unstable. The energy becomes unstable, or whatever is there seems to be unpredictable. And that was the case with the farm. There were times when I did not want to be on the property because I felt that at any time something haywire could happen and I would come out on the worst end of it. And it was just a shift in energy, a buildup of tension or some kind of phenomena that would happen. Once I was running the ghost box inside the farmhouse, this was during the day, and I had my eyes closed for a while so I could try and concentrate better on what was coming through. And when I opened my eyes, I had a bloody little cut on my arm, like someone had taken a paper cutter or a razor and just given me not a deep cut, but a very thin slice. I can't account for it. But these are kinds of things that other investigators often encounter in hostile environments. And I do believe that there are times when, look, folks, it's time to fold up your cards and get out because you don't want to become a serious victim.
Do you think if you had persisted and stayed another night, another 2 nights, that something seriously could have gone wrong?
Well, yes. I think you run the risk of that. What happened with some of the investigators that I worked with was, it was like whatever was there started winnowing them out. And accidents would happen to them right before an investigation night, or they would become mysteriously ill, like emergency room mysteriously ill, something that would force them off the investigation. And pretty soon, we had serious attrition to the number of investigators who were able to come or wanted to come. Even Jack talked about he had a lot of equipment mishaps, breakdowns. Sometimes he felt that something was following him home, giving him nightmares. And I think entities are capable of this, that given enough rope, so to speak, they can attach to people and then start causing serious havoc. It seemed that whatever was resident there had a territory that it liked to stick to, and maybe it couldn't go very far. It's drawing its power from the land. But there are other cases where investigators do get attached, and some of them do have serious trouble.
Tell me about Art Huck. What happened to Art Huck?
Some really freaky UFO stuff. He was a young man at the time. He was working for a farmer and taking the tractor out into some remote areas to work on the land. And there were some times when he saw mysterious lights in the sky. He went camping a couple of times with a couple of friends of his, and they saw mysterious lights in the woods that kind of freaked them out. It was the end of their camping trip. But the main experience happened one night when, his tractor broke down. And he noticed that there was a light in the sky that seemed to come down to the ground, and he went to investigate. And he starts walking along, and he comes upon a landed craft. It totally scares him, and he runs back to the tractor, and he can't get it started. It's just like straight out of the movies. So he's not going to have a fast getaway on a tractor anyway. It takes him a while to he realizes, he says, this thing is not of this earth. This is a saucer-shaped craft that's landed on the ground. He finally gets the tractor going and tears out as fast as you can tear out on a tractor, which is not very fast. And he was so scared that he didn't want to go back to that area. But after a while, he screwed up his courage, and he went back to see if it was still there, and of course it was gone. And there are a lot of residents in Greene County that describe overhead UFO activity, and quite frequently, as though these things are like traveling in paths across the sky. But this was actually a landed craft.
Right. And what decade was this? What year approximately?
That would have been, I believe, in the 70s.
The 70s, And did it leave any imprints in the ground? Was there any, mysterious purple foam or something left behind?
It did not leave like a trace circle or something like that. It was just gone. So, we're left with an eyewitness account that says, I have no evidence, and we run into this all the time, I have no evidence to prove this. I know what I saw. This is what happened. And what do we do with these cases? Well, if a person is credible, then, we take it at face value and see if we can find some corroboration. Were there other people who noticed something mysterious in the sky on that night? Unless somebody reports something, it's very hard to dig these things out.
Right. What do the Native American residents in the area make of all of this? Because there are, I believe there were the Algonquins were settled in this area, the Seneca, a lot of different Native American nations living in this area. What do they make of this? Do they have sort of a theory as to what's going on?
Well, there were quite a few different nations that either traveled through this area or lived temporarily or used it as a hunting ground. And, of course, we have the burial artifacts to indicate actual residences going, pretty far back in history. And so from their perspective, it's like, well, what do you expect if you disturb the energy of the land and the beings who share the landscape with you? What do you expect? Now, at that farm case with the hostile entity, we did have some help from the Shawnee, who gave us some very old original ceremonial tobacco to try a placation exorcism. And we burned the tobacco and we sprinkled some of it around the farmhouse and had an exorcism done there. And it did quiet the place down for about 3 months, but then it came back.
Oh, wow.
And that happens a lot, too. So these massacres that happened early on, this, I think, is part of the reason for a lot of the paranormal activity. That part of Pennsylvania was a very bloody battlefield from about the mid-1700s on, as the colonial white settlers pushed further and further into the territory and beyond. And at first, a lot of the relations were peaceful. And I think an effort was made in many cases on both sides to be friends. But as the colonials started taking over more, it really got a lot of the Native Americans angry. And so there were massacres. The whites were just as bad as the Indians. Whites would go and murder and scalp the Indians as well as vice versa.
So obviously that is imprinted. All that blood soaked into the soil has had an effect. We are out of time, but people can go and get a copy of Haunted Hills and Hollows: What Lurks in Greene County, Pennsylvania. Rosemary, thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Richard. Always a pleasure.
Likewise. VisionaryLiving.com, the website. All right, that's it for me. We are back next week with a brand new program. The mystery of the 432 megahertz frequency. We'll also talk to Dr. Lynn Katai about the Phoenix Lights. Until next time, don't be afraid. There is nothing concealed that won't be revealed, and nothing hidden that won't be made known. What you hear in the dark, speak in the light. What I say in a whisper, proclaim from the housetops. Move over, Aphrodite, I'm coming home. Good night.